Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, with a break in Parliament, attention turns to electioneering. Here out west, a day in the life of Western Sydney. And do we need a new way to talk to teenagers? Joining me on the panel tonight, writer and mental health advocate Mohammed Awad. Thank you so much for joining us. You come all the way from Coffs Harbour to horrible old Sydney on a Friday evening.
Honestly, it's I do it for the mental health. For the people who are struggling out there.
That's right. You're a mental health advocate. We're very pleased that you're here with us. Former New South Wales Liberal MP Michael Yabsley, thank you so much for coming in. Fascinating week in politics.
Absolutely fascinating, Ellen.
Partner in SEC Newgate Communications, Faye Akindoyini, doing the last thing before you go on holidays. Work hard for an hour and then you can go.
Thanks, Ellen.
And in Bendigo tonight, another new panellist, LGBTQI+ advocate, performer and author, Ben McKellen. Thank you so much for joining us, Ben. Wonderful to see your face.
Thanks for having me, Ellen.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. Federal Parliament sittings wrapped up last night, but by morning, both the Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader were out on the hustings. They were in the Northern Territory, where long-serving MP Warren Snowden is retiring, putting the enormous seat of Lingiari in play. Even if you haven't turned your mind to the election yet, be in no doubt it's all these two men are thinking about.
We've got an election coming up where Australians have to make an important decision about who is best to lead them in these incredibly uncertain times. And I think Australians have to compare and contrast between the government I lead on national security and the alternative. And Labor just doesn't measure up to the mark of our government. But the other part that worries me about Anthony Albanese when it comes to national security is that he has always come from the socialist left of the Labor Party. He has always had sympathies with those policies.
What Scott Morrison keeps trying to do as a desperate political measure is divide the country. It is not in Australia's national interest to have a divided country based upon fake news. And we know what his own colleagues think about his capacity to not tell the truth. And they've had almost a decade in office. They can't talk about any of their record in government. They don't want to talk about a plan for the future, which is why they're resorting to desperate scare attacks.
After 2 unedifying weeks in Parliament, including a bitter and divisive stoush over national security and the failure to see a host of legislation passed, including the National Integrity Commission, MPs will be keen to test the waters at home in their electorates. But in New South Wales, the Liberal Party has some particular issues, with pre-selection still on hold in several seats due to internal squabbling. Best you have candidates in the Liberal Party pre-selected if the Prime Minister says an election is imminent. What on earth is going on, Michael?
Ellen, it's pretty hard to put your finger on what is going on. I've been quoting over the last couple of weeks Liberal Party elder statesman Sir John Carrick, who for 40 years was a dominant figure in the Liberal Party. He, wherever he turned up, would say about electioneering and pre-selections, you can't fatten the pig on market day, which was a fairly quaint, old-fashioned way of saying if there's an election coming up, you better pre-select those candidates, you better get them out there in the field, and you'd better make sure that they're properly resourced. And that meant being out there campaigning 12 months before an election.
And they're not even going to have 12 weeks.
That's right. And look, if I'm sounding frustrated and annoyed by this, it's because I am. And of course, there are thousands and thousands of people who feel the same way, because I mean this is analogous to saying, okay, grand final is a few weeks away, but unfortunately we haven't actually got our team together and no one's been doing any training. Now, I think people are allowed to be despairing of those circumstances.
Faye, at the same time, the coalition at the last election had churned through a couple of prime ministers. They had no big policy agenda. They really didn't even have a little policy agenda. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the coalition can't win just because they're fighting against each other so hard about who is pre-selected that they're thinking about going to court about the matter?
I think there's a big difference between 2019 and 2022. The polls they did in 2019 told them that in spite of him being around for over a decade, most people actually didn't have a clue who Scott Morrison was, so they could reinvent him. And, then we got the Daggy Dad and all that kind of stuff. They also did a brilliant job of reframing climate change as a jobs issue. And they also did an amazingly disciplined job of keeping the kind of liberal that most Australians didn't like, so the Eric Abetz, Dutton type extreme jihadist ideologue liberal off the front pages. Unfortunately, if they want to run this strong on keeping us all safe, Dutton is now the Defence Minister, so he has to be a face that we see regularly in this election. Everyone knows exactly who Scott Morrison is, and climate change has become a reality for even the biggest dinosaur in the room. So they're not quite got that clean slate that they had.
And you haven't even mentioned COVID, by the way. That was interesting. I mean, you're a communications expert and they're the things that you're focusing on. I mean, Mohammed, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of the politicking is going to be happening in lots of marginal seats in outer suburban areas all across the east coast of Australia, but Western Sydney will be fair plagued with politicians.
Oh, yeah, definitely, without a doubt.
National security, the religious discrimination protections. In the electorate where you live, 70% of folks voted no to same-sex marriage. So how much of that sort of messaging is getting through, and are people thinking, OK, that they're important issues for me?
I think the religious discrimination bill is actually not a big concern for people in Western Sydney and people in our communities. I think for the most part, when you think about the sort of minority groups that live in Western Sydney, they have bigger concerns right now. Particularly during COVID, particularly people who've lost their jobs, people who are trying to find income in this time and make rent and make mortgages right now. I think the politicizing of the discrimination bill is quite interesting because they're trying to make this image feel like they're trying to create this image of Western Sydney as we've created this bill for them because we have to represent the people in Western Sydney who would discriminate in schools against queer and trans people. I
mean, you're a person of faith yourself.
And
you are a gay man.
I'm very much a queer, I'm very much a Muslim, and we are out here. And I feel like while I think in our communities during the marriage equality bill, when all that stuff was kind of happening, there was a lot of misinformation, there was a lot of pandering and kind of, there's a lot of, government kind of, where are my thoughts and feelings? Sorry, I'm all over the place.
No, you're not. This is very interesting. So, I mean, it's interesting that you went to COVID.
Yeah.
Because these were the areas that were locked down. These were the areas where people were kind of suffering the most and having to do rats every day. And that's interesting. Do you think it's more about cost of living and what's my future going to, real tin tax issues in this election? Because what we've seen the last week in Canberra is really some highfalutin issues around stuff that's maybe not day to day.
Yeah, and I think nothing is clearer in 2020 and 2021 than what was called for a hot minute, the Bondi versus Bankstown dynamic, where people in Bondi were kind of living at large, and people in Bankstown were treated differently, and there was this different standards for people in these minority groups, and we were blaming COVID on Western Sydney.
And that still stings?
And that still stings. I think people will never forget the way that police were, the way that Western Sydney was over-policed, the way that minority groups and people in these sort of spaces were targeted, and it was a different world for Western Sydney during COVID. And I think you couldn't compare the eastern suburbs or North Sydney to what Western Sydney went through. And while I don't think that a lot of people in Western Sydney are, to be quite honest, interested in the discrimination bill in schools, I think they're more focused on, how am I going to make my rent? How am I going to these real life concerns? Because at the end of the day, it's going to come down to how did the Liberal government treat Western Sydney, in the last 2 years? Interesting,
Ben. You are in Bendigo. And we could all go there for the next couple of weeks because that's a safe seat. As it happens, it's a safe Labor seat. So presumably it's a poly-free zone. Is it possible that you can escape all of this or are people there hearing the messages and feeling fatigued?
I think we're still, even though it is a safe seat, we're still very much plugged into what's happening in terms of the election coming up. in terms of gig as a performer, the gig economy, you know, we're dying to get out there. We got out there for a little while in November, and then Omicron came along, and so we're still really rebuilding, being able to get back into work. I know so many people who've hardly worked in the last couple of years. So there's some of the issues, even though perhaps we can't have an impact on them here in terms of our federal member. That's what we're looking for Australians to vote on. It's, you know, that sort of work.
Yeah, and you've got a relative in aged care, a loved one in aged care. How much do you think that issue will cut through at the federal election? Is that something people consider when they cast their vote?
I would have thought it was important. It's certainly important with the people that I'm close to. My dear friend, she's been like a mother to me. I used to see her every 1 to 2 weeks. I haven't seen her since December of 2020. And it breaks my heart. She's somebody with dementia. I don't know what she's going to be like when I see her next. And because of her being isolated and us being isolated, it's just been really difficult. And I think just the aged care issue is a huge thing on people's minds. And I thought it was both a critical and a timely thing that the government needed to look at recently, rather than the religious discrimination bill in the last 2 weeks.
As we mentioned, despite a lot of talk, not a lot actually went through the Parliament in the last session. That's not to say things aren't getting done. Take, for example, the former Sydney school student who led a campaign which has changed the face of sex education in Australia in the course of just 12 months. Appalled at stories of sexual assault experienced by school students, Chanel Contos and her supporters lobbied education ministers around the country, and yesterday they unanimously agreed to enshrine consent education into the school curriculum.
It's been a really hectic year, but a year is a very short time period to be working on something. And I guess I'm just so thankful for all the people who were involved in getting this done so quickly. It was definitely the strength of the numbers and the magnitude of people who came forward that made this a national priority. It's a massive step forward from the lack of consent education that was in the curriculum before.
Saxon Mullins worked for years to see New South Wales consent laws changed. Grace Tame pushed the Let Her Speak reforms with Nina Fennell, and has had recent success in having the wording of child sex offences changed to better reflect their seriousness. Then there's Brittany Higgins and the federal employment reform she called for. Sure, all of these had to ultimately be passed through formal systems, but it begs the question, do you even need to get elected to get real change? Faye?
That it's momentum from outside Parliament is driving the agenda. And that's always been the case. But what's different now is the actual items on that agenda are being controlled by what we would consider everyday people. And that's a function of a whole range of really good things. It's a function of the internet making people who have a similar concern around an issue able to find each other and organise. It's a function of them being able to then get their message out aggressively and consistently, and it's a function of them also being able to raise money sometimes, because these campaigns cost to just help people pay their bills while they're working as volunteers, because relying on people to constantly volunteer to support these things is different. What it does show, though, is that it's become very, very clear that politicians often don't have the internal fortitude to make real change happen without these social movements backing them in. But when they do get those social movements giving them a halo of cover, they will act.
Ben, do you agree with that notion, that sense of urgency that Chanel Contos was and her supporters were able to bring to this issue? Similarly, Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins.
Oh, absolutely. It's well past due. So the urgency is totally there. I'm a survivor of sexual assault when I was a teenager, and that's back 34 years ago now. And there were people around me at that point that I knew that were sexually assaulted. These are things that we are desperate to change, and they're things that need to be addressed as early as possible. The language that we use, the education, as Chanel has pushed for, so consent education in schools. It's really, really important to educate all children, not just as it has seemed in the past that we educate our girls to stay safe, but that we educate our boys not to respect boundaries, to ask for consent, and ask for consent and seek consent for themselves as well.
Yeah. How would consent education have changed the reaction that you got when you tried to disclose to people what had happened to you?
Well, hopefully then the person that I did confide in, and I went to tell them that I'd been sexually assaulted by a bus driver at 9 o'clock at night, that person wouldn't have replied before I'd even given any details. So I hadn't disclosed that I'd been assaulted, that I wouldn't have been admonished for being out at 9 o'clock at night on a bus by myself. And, at the time, as I was assigned female at birth, I lived my first 33 years as a woman, as a female in society, socialised, conditioned, educated as a female. And so I'm out on a bus at 9 o'clock, seeing a friend. I go and tell somebody, I'm frightened that I've been assaulted. And the first thing they think is, well, what were you doing out by yourself at 9 o'clock at night?
And now you have the experience of living as a man. What a fascinating perspective. Would you ever be asked that question, do you think?
Never. I can walk down the street at 1 o'clock in the morning, past a bar. I could get coward punched, and I would be the victim of an unsolicited, violent attack. But if I'd been my former self, pre-transition, then I would have been asked what I was wearing, why I was out at that time by myself. Had I been drinking? Why didn't I catch a taxi home? Why didn't I have friends with me? And we really need to change this as early as possible. The language from government, from media, and within our own community, that we don't expect things from the victims instead of putting the focus on the perpetrators. And that would have made a big difference. But as I said, I can walk down the street, I feel much more comfortable. Some of that conditioning hasn't gone. I do walk down the street and am fearful at times, but I feel much more safe in terms of being attacked and knowing that I'm not going to be asked all those questions.
Isn't it interesting, Faye, that this conversation in this country has been led by a young former schoolgirl in Sydney and voices like Ben's, a trans man?
Yep. It is fascinating because, but it's like anything. If you're the establishment, then you benefit from the established way things are dealt with. If you're not, then you have to break that down. You have to disrupt it. You have to be an agitator. You have to advocate. What's different now is the power of controlling the message has shifted from people who have relationships with journalists like yourself or media outlets to individuals who can find that long tail of like-minded people and can organise and build that critical mass.
So you have whole
communities
possible. Of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who can make their voices heard, who can make their voice. They don't need to stand for Parliament. They can if they want to, but they don't need to stand for Parliament to make change.
But they also have power in a cyclical way at the polling booth, because they basically are the consumer voter, and they only get listened to in that window before an election happens, but they have to be listened to if the politicians want to keep their jobs.
Michael, is there any downside of not having a more ambitious activist political class, as the panellists have been saying, certainly in Canberra in this election? So, I'm not necessarily talking about the coalition governments in New South Wales, in Tasmania. They have had some ambitious policies, but, this government has really dealt with COVID, which has been the huge issue, and hasn't had this big legislative agenda itself.
Eleanor, I think there's something very significant to celebrate in all of this, and You know, it was Bryce Courtney who used the wonderful words, the power of one. Listening to this conversation, it's as though the power of one was only discovered, relatively speaking, yesterday. The truth is, the power of one has been present throughout history, and there are wonderful and amazing cases of people leading an uprising. You know, fast forward to more recent circumstances, I'm thinking of someone like Gary Lynch, not a name that may roll off people's tongues, but the father of Anita Cobby.
Right.
And what he did in the wake of unspeakable tragedy to really reform and facilitate reform of the criminal justice system. Whether you agree with those reforms is another thing.
Is there a risk though? Is there a risk though, hypothetically speaking, if you have something of a vacuum in the political class, that the loudest voice, that the person with the most money gets their way? This goes to your great passion, which is election funding reform.
Look, I think if you look at a Brittany Higgins example or a Grace Tame example, one of the amazing things about the phenomenon of Grace and the phenomenon of Brittany was that they were not actually money-driven campaigns, and I think everyone can take some comfort from that. Now, that's not to say that more often than not, I would say that they're more the exception than the rule. Mainly these things are money driven, and as you pointed out, I mean, this is something that I feel very, very deeply about. I mean, I think democracy has been perverted by the role of money.
And when you look at Clive Palmer, Simon Holmes à Court, who's behind the Climate 200, pushing a lot of money towards all these independents we're seeing, a lot of them standing in Conservative seats, do you have reservations about the influence of that money on either side of the political spectrum?
I have major concerns, the deepest concerns, about what is happening right across the political spectrum, from as left as you can go to as right as you can go. If the question is, am I comfortable with, in a free market society, am I comfortable with Clive Palmer throwing $80 million at an election campaign? No, I'm not.
Because it's Clive Palmer?
No, not because it's Clive Palmer. I would be as uncomfortable if it were Simon Holmes à Court throwing $80 million. I would be and that's why I am uncomfortable about the track that my own party is on, together with all the major parties. I mean, this is not a case of pox on both their houses. This is a pox on all their houses. And frankly, what jumps out at me from what's happened in the last week, the Zali Steggall situation tells me something absolutely unambiguously, and that is that politicians and aspiring politicians are addicted to big money. And otherwise, why wouldn't Climate 200 be more willing to embrace the sort of change that is necessary to put the broom through the whole system? And frankly, I am amazed and disappointed. There are a whole lot of things that I don't agree with Climate 200 on, but I liked what they were saying about the need to reform the whole role of money in politics. I think, in the last week they've kicked an own goal. I think they've done enormous damage to the reputation that they have been trying to build about their own integrity.
Let me just go briefly to Mohammed on this one. This is a big deal, this consent. I mean, people of your... How old are you?
I'm 22.
Wow. People of your age... I'm so old. It's okay. I'm reacting.
I'm ready to retire. I don't know what you mean. I'm tired.
You've had a busy 4 years.
I'm done. Yeah.
You're so far from retirement. This is a big deal to your generation.
Yeah.
Did you try? You tried to do something about it?
Yeah, no, like even in our own school, me and one of my close friends, Hiba Ali, we emailed our school after we graduated saying, can we have some sex education and consent education in our school? Because we don't remember ever getting any kind of formal education on how we could manage any of that. And we wanted it also to be, queer inclusive and trans inclusive in sex education and in consent education.
No response?
And no response.
Public school? Religious school?
It's a private school,
yeah.
Not religious school. So it's very interesting. I think we're kind of waiting a response. So we said we'd email twice, and if they didn't email us back, we were going to do an open letter and make it another big campaign. It's like even us ourselves are, moving back to activism and moving back to these grassroots campaigns to push
And
these
because
things
you
forward.
see this sort of thing and you think, well, we can have an effect.
We tried this like almost 7 months ago. So even prior to this,
Yeah,
it
right.
was like there's this happening at different schools. These discussions are happening in different schools and different places all across Australia. And it's taken a while. And I'm so happy to see the consent education's coming through. But I really hope, and I really well and truly hope, it's inclusive and it's also providing consent and sex education for queer and trans people as well.
One of the regions most likely to be visited by politicians during the election campaign will be what is loosely described as Western Sydney. During the worst of the outbreak of COVID in New South Wales, as Mohammed was saying, the suburbs of Greater Western Sydney were tagged the areas of concern, hit hardest with lockdowns, but also the home base of much of the wider city's workforce. Home to about 1 in 11 Australians. They're also among the most diverse areas in the country, with about 35% of the population born overseas. So with an area that big and that complex, it's easy to miss the people beyond the statistics. But a new film, it's so wonderful, such a wonderful film, called Here Out West, tried to explore the rich diversity, telling 8 interconnected stories over the course of a single day in Western Sydney. Here's a taste.
Oi, Robbie!
Hey! What's up, man?
Do me a favour, get rid of the ratty. If you dressed a bit better, you wouldn't be in trouble as much.
Is that why you moved out? Me and Dad were holding you down, huh?
What's he saying? I don't know. He only spoke to us in English.
Look, I can't help it if your cousin wants me, bro.
She doesn't want you.
You think you're Muhammad Ali or Masadi?
Wait, chill, boys, relax.
To tell us about the film and why he and his colleagues wrote it, filmmaker and actor Arka Das joins us from Sydney. Congratulations on this film. I intended to watch 10 minutes of it, but I ended up watching the whole thing, and I think in a spectacular lack of productivity, everybody on the team did too. It's such an amazing film. You somehow bring the passion and the vitality that we see about like a day in the life of a big city to this big, geographically spread out, flat suburban area. What was your pitch? What was your concept?
Thank you for watching the film and thank you for your kind words. It's really nice to have people from Western Sydney and outside of Western Sydney watch this film, of course. This film started as an initiative really to find like 8 emerging voices from Western Sydney. So we didn't go in wanting to make a film. We just went in to be a part of this sort of initiative. And we went in with, some of us went in with some stories, but most of us went in with sort of no idea of what was going to happen. And we had a great script producer called Blake Ashford, and the producers, the production companies Co-Curious and Emerald got together. This was their brainchild. And sort of by day 3 of our first development session, I think the producers were like, gosh, these stories are really great. I think we might have a feature film on our hands. And at the time it was really exciting. I didn't think we would come this far, but I think we kind of just wanted to tell personal stories about Western Sydney, and we wanted to tell stories and represent characters that hadn't been represented in Australian cinema before. I felt like Australia, and I've been working as an actor for a while, but as a writer, I'm kind of new to the industry. And I wanted to see these characters on our screen because I think, as you said, it's 1 in 11 people are from Western Sydney. So why shouldn't we see more people from Western Sydney represented in our cinema and TV?
Mohammed, you saw it made you cry?
Several times, absolutely. It was a beautiful film, honestly. Like, shout out to Nasreen Amin and Fadi Aboud and all the incredible creators behind that.
Which bits made you cry?
Well, the story with the Filipino nurses, the immigrant story with the Kurdish family, the Lebanese. It was at every point I had to
Did you recognise them?
I think I know every single person in this film. Like, I think I know every single person that you guys wrote about and you guys depicted.
So the overworked nurses.
The overworked nurses. I mean, I've been in the healthcare system for I don't know how long now, too long. But during COVID, watching all the kind of burnt out nurses and other healthcare workers, and we've been doing double shifts and overnights and like just breaking our bodies down, trying to protect New South Wales and protect our country, and seeing that with our nurses as well. And just there was that moment where she cries when she kind of passes on the child to the vet. I'm just like,
And there was a lovely little moment, Arka, in it where at the beginning of the film, there's a little Lebanese girl, and she's just speaking in Arabic the whole time. She clearly understands a little bit of English. And then as the film goes on, there's not 1 or 2 or 3, but there's 9 languages being spoken. And, you know, you've got Aboriginal directors. Like the logistics involved in this.
Yeah. The logistics were crazy. I can't sort of say it was easy. I mean, I worked as a writer. I acted in the film. I played the character of Robbie, but also, you know, we were all given associate producer credits, the writers, which meant that we could be involved from like the beginning with this, from the script stage right through to now, while the film's out in cinemas at the moment. So, you know, through to marketing. That's a really progressive avant-garde sort of style of filmmaking in Australia. Like, it hasn't really happened before. It just means that it's not top down and the hierarchy sort of changes in filmmaking, and you know, it allows the directors to be close to the writers and use them as resources for these specific chapters, the nuances, the complexities of the characters, the costumes, everything. You know, we were able to make like pitch documents, vision packages to give to the directors and the production team, but we had 1 editor, 1 cinematographer, and 1 production designer. So that really helped to bring together the cohesiveness of the film and keep it sort of unified. You know, if you watch it, you can kind of see that it's the same color palette, the same kind of style. But yeah, it's an anthology. So, you know, there's 8 chapters, 9 languages, 5 directors. It was a big team, and we shot during the pandemic. We shot at the end of 2020, like October or November 2020. So it was a crazy time. But I'm just glad that we were given that power as writers to, like, you know, take this story right through to the end and make sure that it was all done, you know, not just stylistically right, but, you know, truthful and authentic.
I'm interested, Ben. You are a story teacher, a storyteller, and an activist. Your T-shirt is the name of your show, Trans Mansplaining. What is the effect of telling and hearing diverse stories? What impact does that have on your audience?
Oh, it's no doubt has a positive effect on, there's 2 sides of it. So there's the aspect of our community seeing our stories being represented. So a young trans person seeing a trans man talking about being trans. But the other side of it is the empathy that people can engender and putting themselves in our shoes when they get to know somebody. So they hear my story or other queer stories and they go, okay, Ben could be my brother, you know, he could be my cousin, he could be my workmate. And as soon as you start to know somebody who is LGBTIQA+, or in the case of this film, culturally and linguistically diverse, neurodiverse, disabled, whatever it is, then you can't discriminate against them as easily. You can't hate them when you know them. And it goes to show, really, that we're more the same than different. Arka,
your character in it, who's kind of, you're a yobbo, I think that's fair. You're a yobbo in the film, but you have the Bengali language skills that a young woman in hospital needs. She doesn't have them, even though that's her heritage, to help her father to die, to hear his language as he dies. I mean, that was an extraordinary moment.
Yeah, thank you. That chapter is written by great writer Beena Bhattacharya. She and I sort of worked together to fuse the 2 chapters together. And Robbie, my character, he kind of goes into, you know, he kind of goes across 2 chapters. I mean, he's just a young guy from Western Sydney, really. Like that's the idea with Brotherhood, my chapter, where the 3 boys sort of start in the blocks. And the idea is that I wanted to break down the idea of sort of masculinity in Western Sydney. I think, you know, in the news and the media outlets, you see a lot of reports about boys from Western Sydney, and they're represented in a sort of, it's always got a negative stigma around it, or they're represented in a certain way. But I wanted to show the heart and depth of these people and the fact that they all have stories to tell as well. They have things going on in their lives, and when it comes down to it, they're actually very loyal, and they're committed to helping the community, and they're committed to helping people around them. Because I grew up in Western Sydney, and that was sort of my upbringing. So Robbie is a character that he's kind of mucks around with his mates, and he's in this kind of situation. But like when it comes down to it, and I won't give too much away, but there is an accident in the film, and they're pulled into another story. And then his superpower at the end of the day is that he speaks his language, and he can help someone who is of an older generation connect with her dying father. So I think, it's a really poignant moment in the film. And I think, through that process, the character of Robbie, my character, grows and becomes a man. And I think, that's sort of that point of those two moments in the film. But I'm glad you resonated with him.
Oh,
with it.
It was lovely. As a mother of young men, that's what you want them to be. They're kind of there's a sort of doofus element to young men, and their values shine through on this extraordinary day when all these events happen and they need to be their best. And life is hard and challenging, and unexpected things happen, and these people had to be their best on this day. And it's what's the impact of seeing that in your backyard?
I think it's monumental, really. I think this is a landmark film, in terms of representation and in terms of where Australian cinema is right now. I think it's at a crossroads. Like, I think we need to see and hear more of these stories. But we didn't set out to make a film, I'll just be clear, we didn't set out to make a film about, just diverse stories.
No, it's a great film. It's just a great film.
We set out to make a new Australian work, and I think that's what we want people, hopefully, to go and see it. We've had really lovely responses in the first couple of weeks to people going and seeing this film. Some of the messages we've been getting as a writing team and the producers, they're amazing. I can't, I don't have the words to explain what they mean to us, but definitely people saying things like how it's affected them personally, how they see themselves in it, how they see their mom, their dad, their parents.
Mohammed's nodding away.
Their neighbours, and like what Mohammed said about being nurses or healthcare workers. Western Sydney has all the healthcare workers, retail workers, frontline workers. We didn't mean to even put that in the film because when we were making this film, COVID didn't exist. That wasn't a thing. So, we didn't even know there was going to be this pandemic. So it's just kind of crazy how it all just ties in together. And I think what it comes down to is being authentic and telling authentic stories from a real place and having the power as young Western Sydney emerging creatives and young creatives of linguistically different backgrounds and culturally diverse backgrounds to be able to tell your own story, and be elevated to a big screen in Australia. I think that's the most important thing, so that the mainstream audience can actually watch the work.
We're short on time, Faye. You've got to see it.
I've definitely put it in my list now.
Yeah.
Is it on Netflix?
No, it's in selected cinemas and on the ABC later in the year. But just quickly, you're a communications professional. This is what you do. What's the significance of this sort of art, this sort of communication? Just quickly for me.
Oh, it's so powerful. I mean, you cannot be what you cannot see. So representation is so powerful and important. It's not just the stories you tell. So you put a face to the stories. So you put a face to the broader definition of what it is to be an Australian, instead of the monochromatic version that we've historically had served up to us in our culture. But you also provide the skills for people at the back of this to keep making this kind of creative content.
Wonderful. Well said. Arko Das, lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for the film. Filmmaker and actor. And as I said, you can see the film in selected cinemas and on the ABC later this year. And speaking of the West, the WA Premier has this evening announced the state will open its borders from March 3, so long as you've had 3 injections. You're watching The Drum, and with me on the panel, former New South Wales Liberal MP Michael Yabsley, writer and mental health advocate Mohammed Awad, in Melbourne, partner at SEC Newgate Communications Faye Akindoyini, and in Bendigo tonight, LGBTIQ+ advocate, performer and author Ben McAllen. And finally tonight, if as adults we all seem to have enough trouble talking to each other in a meaningful way, what hope for talking to teenagers and, probably more important, hearing what they have to say? Daisy Turnbull has had a crack at it with a guidebook, as it were, called 50 Questions to Ask Your Teen. Daisy's been a teacher for more than a decade and a mother for a little less than that, but she's had a big think in this book about how to actually help your kids figure out who they are and what they want. Hi Daisy, thank you for coming into the foyer. Sorry you couldn't be upstairs.
Thank you for having me.
I was like, I'm probably a terrible mother, and I thought, here we go, someone's going to tell me to talk to them in the car and to ask them whether they had a good day and to listen to their answers. But actually this is so much more than this. Such a thoughtful view on the ways in which you can talk to young people. And the starting point is, I think I have it right, that you're saying we need to explicitly teach teenagers, as the adults around them, how to be adults.
Yeah, I think we often assume teenagers will just learn the stuff that we know as adults, and we're shocked when they don't know how to do it. And I guess the best way to see how that's true is with the meme that adulting is hard. And I think that we're not necessarily giving teenagers that experience to learn how to do the things that make them not only a good adult, but hopefully a good flatmate one day.
Yeah, and so the questions then become like, what can you help with, and a kind of spatial awareness of what's around you. And my children will kill me, but I did a quick quiz in the house, and no one knew how much milk there was in the fridge when the bins were supposed to go out, but they all had a very close idea of how many chocolate cornettos were in the freezer. In fact, both were absolutely correct. So it's about that mental load, isn't it? Teaching them about that mental load, which is, yeah, you just answer the question, then we'll go on. Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, I was going to say it is. And I think mental load is something we as adults are only learning about. And so I think it's a great time for teenagers to learn about it before all the resentment around the mental load is set in.
And values, not rules, was another one. What's the trick around shared values, particularly if the adults and parents don't agree on fundamental issues like sexuality and religion and how to live your life?
Ultimately, as a parent of a teenager, and I've seen this as a teacher and having been a teenager, you are slowly letting go of all the authority you have in the room. And so rules will not always work, but raising teenagers with values and being able to use the language of values is something that will be able to carry on through to their adult years. And especially, and I mentioned in the book, you know, you might have a family with different views around sexuality or culture or religion, or even, you know, have a separated family in a co-parenting arrangement. And so, you know, bedtimes might be different, or rules about going out might be different, but the value of respect would be the same. So it broadens the language that teens grow up with.
And I think you were talking, I mean, one of those values I think was kindness, which would seem very powerful if young people are finding their identity in ways that their adults around them find difficult to grapple with.
Absolutely, and kindness is so important and so strong, and I think very different to niceness, and that's what is so important to talk to all teenagers about, but especially teenage girls. You know, it's this idea of consciously being kind, not just deciding to be nice because it's what's expected of you.
And what's the difference?
Well, I think kindness is an active, it's an action, and it's a decision to act a certain way, and it doesn't have to be a great task. It's about thinking of other people in your life, whereas niceness is often about avoiding confrontation and not necessarily being who you are. You can absolutely be who you are and stand up for yourself and have strong boundaries while also being kind.
Yeah. Mohammed, I'm going to ask one of those stupid questions journalists ask.
Go for it.
How difficult was it to grow up Arab, Muslim and queer?
Well, it's not the easiest to do in the world, for sure. I'd like to say that I think, I always say that when, you know, as a Arab person or Muslim person or a person of colour, or as part of any minority group, generally speaking, when you experience an act of racism or a discriminatory act, you can be comforted and consoled by your family. Your family experiences it as a unit, right? But the experience of being queer or trans is an individual experience, and so you can feel isolated within your family unit. And I think also parents and families don't necessarily have the education or the skills to support or comfort a queer person, particularly from our communities as well. There isn't that education yet. And so I think that's kind of the biggest thing is the isolation of being queer, Arab, and Muslim for a long time, until you step out and you realize, oh, queer Muslims have existed for thousands of years since the beginning of Islam. Before Islam, there were queer Arabs in the Middle East for thousands of years, and a lot of the issues we have around queer identity and conservative cultures and ideas aren't actually embedded in my religion, they're embedded in culture, and that was changed by colonialism, by these practices across the Middle East that kind of shaped what was acceptable and not acceptable. And I've also found that being queer and Muslim and being Muslim is an individual experience. It's about my relationship with God. And I think that in the past, it's kind of been muddled with all these other aspects of culture and identity. But I think that's the biggest thing, is that if I get called a terrorist at school one day, my dad and my mum will know how to comfort me and say, that's not okay, and here's why, and here's what you can do. If I say that someone called me the F slur today at school, they're gonna be frightened because they're scared of what that means for themselves and for the family and for the name. But I think I have a lot of compassion for my family and for my community, because it's just a matter of education, it's just a matter of time. And particularly for minority groups, for Arab groups or Southeast Asian groups, we're just trying to make it in Australia as is, where racist structures and systems do exist, and we're trying to make space for ourselves in all these different industries, even in film and media, like with Here Out West. And I think the thing that's always stuck with me is the question my parents always asked me is, even before knowing I was queer, was, what are you going to give back to your community? And for me, it was being a mental health support, being a mental health person, a professional, and giving back to Western Sydney, giving back to queer Muslims. That's what it was for me. And for my friends, like Fahiba Ali, the writer-director I mentioned earlier, she created a short film called Angrezi, which is about the immigrant experience, but it has this twist to it, and it has this take on being an immigrant. And for her, the question of what can I give back to my community is representation. And it's amazing seeing these minority groups try and find ways of existing, of being, you know?
Ben, you've had such a fascinating life now as a trans man. Is there a question that you wished you'd been asked growing up?
I was thinking about this, reflecting on how my parents are of an age where children should be seen and not heard. And then probably the next generation down, it was that we should, that we should be heard, but we really should be more like our parents, or our parents had the opportunity to create in us the parts of themselves that they wanted to be if they weren't successful of it. I think what's so great about Daisy's book is that she really talks about making sure that I like the chapter like what brings you joy. I really would have loved, it's not a gendered thing at all. It's, what I would have liked my parents to have asked that. Like, I wrote music. I had a guitar and I would sing, and I wrote songs in my bedroom and all through my teens. And in my 20s, I came to my parents with this recording from a recording studio of 20 songs that I had written, and they hadn't heard one of them. I'd sat in my bedroom singing and they'd not heard. So they didn't know who I was. They didn't know what brought me joy. Because they had expectations of what they wanted me to be. And they wanted me to be happy and they wanted me to be successful, but they didn't actually ask the questions that found out who I was.
Faye, this is an interesting discussion, because in terms of adulting, there'll be lots of kids living in Australia whose parents don't have English, who've been adulting from a very young age. Lucy starts the book and says, one thing that a lot of kids would do well would be to get on the phone to the utilities company and sit there for 2 hours. Well, a lot of kids have. A lot of kids have done that and enrolled their brothers and sisters in school and figured out all the administrivia of life because they've got the English skills.
That's true. The book is very helpful, but I do think it speaks to one segment of our society, and I know that it's a big enough problem, it's a big enough challenge to address that you can't meet all the needs. But it'd be interesting to see what a book like this would look like for people who are first generation Australian, what this would look like for First Peoples, what this would look like. It's a useful tool for every part of our society, and it'd be really interesting to see how it might be picked up and carried on by others.
What do you think about that, Daisy? Because, there's so much in this book, and you had so many conversations with such a diverse group of people. Is there a universality about it?
I think for some of it there's a universality, and some of it it is about, the question is not targeted to one group, but potentially in the body of the paragraph it's inviting parents to consider how they might want that answer to be approached. But I can't pretend to speak for everyone, and I recognise that, and I would love it to be picked up and run with by different communities. I think that would be wonderful.
Well, I think that the last question is a universal. What do you want me to ask you?
Yeah, you know, that's a really important one, and one of the reasons I came up with this book was my experience volunteering at Lifeline, because there are so many, you know, especially women in their 50s and 60s who call because they're lonely and they don't have good relationships with their kids. And there are so many reasons for that. But I do think that the relationship you have with your children when they become adults is formed when they are teenagers. And it's that idea of changing the relationship and saying, I want you to come to me when you need to now that you're an adult, and how can I help that happen?
That's lovely. Michael, both parent and child. How do you reflect on this, firstly for yourself, growing up and trying to form your identity? Was there an openness? Was there a possibility that you could be who you really are?
The answer to that is no, and thank goodness things have changed. You know, the world that I grew up in is a world apart from the world that it is today. The conversations that I had with my parents are a world apart from the conversations that I have with my children, and my children who are now growing up have with me. And again, you know, we can only be very thankful that that is the case. I mean, my main objective as a teenager was to be able to creep into the house at 11 o'clock at night without my parents hearing, and
let alone coming in and saying, "Mum, Dad, I'm gay, and can we have a chat about that?" Did you have the language for that, or would they not have heard that?
I probably did have the language, but there was no way in the world I was going to use it.
Right, because
it was like so many other things, it was taboo, and you know, I wasn't about to drop that sort of dead cat on the table in my otherwise pretty happy family, and I'm sure that's the environment that a lot of the children of the 50s and 60s and even 70s grew up in. Now,
because what would have happened if you dropped that on the table?
Now, look, and this is one of those great questions.
Yeah.
We'll die wondering, won't we? And it may be. And having had the conversation with many others who are contemporaries of mine, who did have the courage to have that conversation, in some cases it was a nightmare that unleashed World War III. In other cases, it led to the most reassuring and comforting message of all. You know, darling, that's fine. We will always love you.
And you had to have that conversation with your adult children. What sort of relationship had you forged with them, and how did that conversation go? What sort of questions did you get?
Well, you know, this is, and I think you're referring to the fact that I came out as a gay man, and had at that time growing up children. Look, it was a conversation. I don't think anyone could ever say that conversation was easy, but it was just in a totally different context, a totally different world, a totally different level of honesty compared with what happened a few decades earlier.
Ben, in your stage work, there's almost an element of You Can't Ask That, the ABC series, to it, where you say, you know, ask. These are the questions. These are all the questions, and I'm going to answer all the questions. What are some good questions that you pose and answer for yourself?
Oh, what are some of the questions that I pose and answer for myself? I was going to tell you some of the things that people ask me, but. Yeah, that's a difficult one. I'm not sure about it. I do want to say, while I think of it, Daisy, in terms of Lifeline, boy, I wouldn't be here today if not for Lifeline. So shout out, I know we mention it at the end of programs to call Lifeline if needed. I literally would not be here without Lifeline. So I just want to say how important they've been in my life. I really appreciate also the gender stereotypes that we should avoid when we have these conversations. I haven't read all of the book, but I got a good chunk of the way through, and I think it's really important that we're asking the same questions. There are, of course, questions about what I would call plumbing that may be different for some parts of your family than others, but most of your questions fit whether you're non-binary, identifies female or male. So they're fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, you've got some activists here, Daisy. I love the part in the book where you talk about being an active, aware citizen, somewhere between apathy and activism, and you put your tongue firmly in your cheek and say, God forbid your children should think about climate change or domestic and family violence as a result of reading this book. Heavens above. No. What sort of questions can you ask the young people around you to create that sense of being an active, aware citizen?
I think it's as simple as asking teenagers what they think about what's happening in the news or what they think about current affairs, and recognising they are exposed to a lot more than they used to be because of social media, because of the internet, and recognising that we teach them how to write essays and construct arguments from age 12, and it's foolish to not think that skill will be used to construct their own arguments and opinions.
Faye, you're laughing away. You're a communications consultant. I think you're thinking of your daughter right about now.
I think they weaponise the ability to construct arguments. It is just, they are the most lean into it generation of humankind. It is amazing. And I'm really glad they are, because I also think they set high bars for themselves because they set high bars for us. And that's probably a good thing. And we talked earlier about why is it that advocacy appears to be more successful in the political sphere. Yeah. That's because they're good at it.
Last question, Daisy. I love your thoughts about being open-minded. If you think you've got all the answers, you are by definition closed-minded. How do you encourage somebody to be open-minded?
I read an article, and I'm not going to remember who wrote it, that a friend sent me about the importance of having a scout mindset over a soldier mindset, and going into conversations wanting to learn more rather than just going in with your opinion. And I think that's one of the most important things we can teach teenagers, and frankly a lot of adults, to go in open-minded and wanting to learn more about a topic. Don't assume that what you know is all there is to know about something.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Wasn't this a wonderful panel to talk to it about? Mohammed, will you come back?
Anytime you will have me, I'll fly over.
And Ben, will you come back and talk to us?
Oh, I'll fly up if I'm allowed.
Yes, we can all. Have a wonderful holiday, Faye.
Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for coming in, Michael. It's much appreciated. See if you can sort out the Liberal Party in New South Wales.
It's a big job.
If this topic has raised any questions, call Lifeline numbers on the screen. Have a great weekend. Good night.